Most people know the name Anne Frank. They know the diary. They know the hiding place. They know she was a Jewish girl in Amsterdam who spent over 2 years concealed in a secret annex while the world outside was consumed by war. But very few people know what happened after the door was broken open. The arrest, the journey, the camps, the final weeks. That part of her story has largely been left in the margins. And it is, in many ways, the most important part to understand. What she endured in the last 7 months of her life was something the diary never captured, because by then, she had no diary left. To understand what Anne Frank's final months looked like, you first have to understand what the 2 years before them cost her. Anne Frank was born on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt, Germany, to Otto and Edith Frank. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, the family emigrated to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where Otto established a business trading in pectin and spices. For several years, life in Amsterdam was relatively stable. Anne attended school, made friends, and by all accounts was a bright, socially engaged child with a particular gift for writing. That stability ended in May 1940, when Germany invaded and occupied the Netherlands. Anti-Jewish laws followed swiftly. The same pattern that had played out in Germany, Austria, and Poland was now imposed on Dutch Jews. Jews were barred from public spaces, required to wear the yellow star, forbidden from running businesses, removed from schools. By the summer of 1942, deportations from the Netherlands had begun. Jews were being transported east, officially described as labor deployment. What that meant in practice was not yet fully understood by most Dutch Jews, but the deportation notices were enough. When Anne's older sister Margot received a call-up order in July 1942, Otto Frank activated a plan he had been quietly preparing for months. On July 6, 1942, the Frank family, Otto, Edith, Margot, and 13-year-old Anne, moved into the hidden rear section of Otto's business premises at 263 Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. The entrance was concealed behind a movable bookcase. They were joined over the following weeks by 4 others: Herman and Augusta van Pels, their teenage son Peter, and a dentist named Fritz Pfeffer. 8 people in total, hidden in a set of rooms that had no natural light in the living areas and required near absolute silence during business hours below. Anne had been given a diary, a red and white checkered autograph book, for her 13th birthday, just weeks before the family went into hiding. She began writing in it almost immediately and continued through the entire period of concealment. The diary recorded daily life in the annex with a level of emotional and observational precision that has made it one of the most widely read documents of the 20th century. She wrote about boredom, about fear, about conflict with the other inhabitants, about her developing relationship with Peter van Pels, about her aspirations to become a writer after the war. She also wrote about the sounds from outside, the Allied bombing raids, the shifting news from the front, and about the creeping awareness that the war could not go on forever. What she could not write about, because she had no way to know, was that she had fewer than 8 months left. The people who kept them alive during those 2 years were a small group of trusted employees of Otto's company, led by Miep Gies and Johannes Kleiman. They brought food, news, and supplies at considerable personal risk. The network required constant vigilance and secrecy. Any slip, any wrong observation by a neighbor, any loose word, and the hiding place could be compromised. For 25 months it held. What ended it, and how, is a question that has occupied historians for decades and still does not have a completely settled answer. On the morning of August 4th, 1944, a car stopped outside 263 Prinsengracht in Amsterdam. The men who stepped out were led by SS Oberscharführer Karl Silberbauer, an Austrian member of the SD, the SS Security Service, based in Amsterdam. With him were several members of the Dutch Security Service, the collaborating Dutch police unit that worked alongside the German occupying forces. They entered the building, went directly to the hidden annex, and broke through the concealed entrance. The timing and direction of the raid have been the subject of investigation for decades. Whoever informed on the hiding place, if it was indeed a deliberate tip-off and not some other form of detection, has never been definitively identified. Several suspects have been proposed and examined over the years, including a Dutch warehouse worker named Willem van Maren and others connected to the building. A 2022 investigation by a cold case team, led by retired FBI agent Vince Pankoke, proposed a Jewish notary named Arnold Vandenberg as a likely source, though this conclusion was disputed by the Anne Frank house and other historians, and the question remains formally unresolved. What is documented is the arrest itself. All 8 inhabitants of the annex were taken, along with 2 of the helpers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, who were arrested at the premises. Miep Gies and Bep Voskyle, also helpers, were present but were not taken. Silberbauer released them. After the arrested were removed, Miep Gies returned to the annex and found Anne's papers scattered on the floor. She collected them, including the diary, and kept them in a drawer without reading them, hoping that she might one day be able to return them to Anne. The 8 annex inhabitants were taken first to the Gestapo headquarters in Amsterdam at the Uiterpeststraat, where they were processed. From there, they were transferred to the Huis van Bewaring, the House of Detention, on the Wateringschans, a pre-trial holding facility in Amsterdam. Anne Frank was 15 years old. After several days at the Wateringschans, all 8 were transferred to Westerbork, the Dutch transit camp in the northeast of the Netherlands, through which nearly all Dutch Jews deported to the east passed. Westerbork was not a death camp. It was a collection and transit point. People lived in barracks, were assigned work details, and waited for the weekly Tuesday transport that would take them further east. Because the Frank group had been in hiding, classified as diving under the occupation, they were automatically registered in the punishment barracks on arrival and assigned to the camp's most physically demanding labor, breaking apart old batteries with chisels and hammers, separating the components for reuse. The work covered hands and faces in black chemical dust and was toxic. It was performed for long hours by people already weakened by 2 years of restricted living. The noise of hammers, the dust, the physical exhaustion. It was a deliberate degradation applied to those the camp administration had decided warranted the harshest treatment. They had approximately 3 weeks at Westerbork. The last transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz left on September 3, 1944. The Franks were on it, and what waited at the other end was something none of the diary's pages had prepared Anne for. The train that left Westerbork on September 3, 1944, carried 1,019 people. It was the last transport from Westerbork to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most lethal of the Nazi extermination and concentration camp complexes, located in occupied Poland near the town of Oświęcim. The journey took 3 days. The passengers were transported in sealed freight cars, wooden cattle wagons with no sanitation, minimal air, no space to sit or lie down for the majority. Water was not provided. Food was not provided. The conditions in the wagons over a 3-day journey in early September were suffocating. When the train arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on the night of September 5, 1944, it pulled onto the selection ramp inside the camp complex. The platform was lit by floodlights. SS guards with dogs lined the tracks. New arrivals were ordered off the wagons and told to leave their belongings. SS doctors and officers then conducted the selection, the process by which new arrivals were divided into those who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers and those who would be registered as camp laborers. The entire process was designed to appear orderly, to prevent panic. Those selected for immediate death were told they were going to shower facilities and would be reunited with their families afterward. Of the 1,019 people on that transport, 549 were sent directly to the gas chambers on arrival, primarily the elderly, the very young, and mothers with children under 15. Anne was 15 and was registered as a laborer. So were Margot, Edith, Auguste Van Pels, and the other adult women. Otto Frank and the other men were separated from the women on the ramp, the last time Otto would see his wife or daughters alive. The women were processed into the camp, heads shaved, arms tattooed with prisoner identification numbers, civilian clothing replaced with the thin striped prisoner uniform. They were assigned to the women's section of Birkenau, the largest sub-camp of the Auschwitz complex. The conditions at Birkenau were extreme in every dimension. The barracks were wooden structures originally designed as horse stables, packed far beyond their intended capacity. Sleeping platforms were shared by multiple prisoners. Sanitation was inadequate for the population held. Food consisted of thin soup and small rations of bread. The water supply was unreliable and often contaminated. Disease, typhus, dysentery, scarlet fever, moved through the barracks constantly. Work details at Birkenau involved hard physical labor, carried out regardless of weather, with roll calls that sometimes lasted for hours in rain or cold. Anne was there for approximately 8 weeks. Several survivors who were at Birkenau at the same time as Anne have provided accounts of encounters with her during this period. A Dutch Jewish woman named Blomme Evers Emden, who knew Anne from before the war, saw her at Birkenau and later described the condition she observed. Anne appeared thin and frightened but alert. Another survivor, Leanne Brillisleiper, also encountered Anne and Margot during their time in the camp, and later gave detailed testimony about what she witnessed in the weeks that followed. What emerged consistently from these accounts was that Anne remained aware and communicative even in the conditions of Birkenau. She had not retreated into silence. She spoke with other prisoners, asked questions, maintained a sense of where she was and what was happening around her. That awareness was, in a way, its own kind of suffering, because she could see what the camp was. But Birkenau was not where Anne Frank's story ended. In late October 1944, a selection was conducted in the women's camp, and it sent Anne and Margot somewhere else entirely. In late October 1944, as the Soviet army advanced from the east and the German military began evacuating the eastern camps, a selection was held in the women's section at Birkenau. Women deemed still capable of labor were to be transferred west to camps inside Germany. Anne and Margot were among those selected for transfer. Edith Frank was not selected. She remained at Birkenau. She died there on January 6, 1945, of illness and exhaustion. Weeks before Soviet forces liberated the camp, on January 27, 1945, Anne and Margot were transported to Bergen-Belsen, a camp located on a heath in the Lüneburg region of northern Germany, near the town of Celle. Bergen-Belsen had originally been established in 1943 as a prisoner of war camp, and then as a holding facility for Jewish prisoners who might be exchanged for German nationals held abroad. By late 1944, it had been overwhelmed by the influx of prisoners evacuated from camps further east. Bergen-Belsen had no gas chambers. It was not, in the formal classification used by historians, an extermination camp. But by the winter of 1944 to 1945, it had become something that killed in a different and in some ways more indiscriminate way, through catastrophic overcrowding, starvation, disease, and the near total collapse of any functioning infrastructure. The camp's population had grown from around 7,000 in July 1944 to over 60,000 by March 1945. That growth was driven by the evacuation of camps further east as the Soviet army advanced. Tens of thousands of prisoners were marched or transported westward, arriving at Bergen-Belsen in a state of severe exhaustion and malnutrition. The camp administration, never designed for this scale, collapsed entirely under the pressure. Food deliveries became erratic and then negligible. The water supply could not serve the number of people confined within the wire. The dead accumulated faster than they could be dealt with. Anne and Margot arrived at Bergen-Belsen in late October or early November 1944. They were assigned to the women's section of the camp, housed in tents initially. The barracks were already beyond capacity, before being moved into a barrack. Leanne Brillisleiper, who had encountered both sisters at Birkenau and was also transferred to Bergen-Belsen, provided some of the most detailed first-hand testimony about Anne and Margot's final weeks. She described seeing them during the Bergen-Belsen period, both suffering from the cold, from hunger, and from the deteriorating conditions of the camp. She noted that both had contracted scabies, a parasitic skin condition caused by mites that spread rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the camp. Their clothing was inadequate for the northern German winter. Then typhus reached them. Typhus is a bacterial disease transmitted by body lice. It produces a sustained high fever, severe headaches, muscle pain, and as it progresses, confusion and loss of consciousness. In the conditions of Bergen-Belsen in the winter of 1944 to 1945, with no functioning delousing facilities, no adequate medical care, no access to clean water, and a population packed so tightly that the disease moved from person to person with extraordinary speed, a typhus outbreak became an epidemic. By early 1945, the disease was killing prisoners by the hundreds each day. There was no treatment available. There were no doctors with supplies. There was no mechanism to isolate the sick from the healthy because the categories had effectively collapsed. Margot Frank contracted typhus first. She became severely ill and was no longer able to leave her bunk. Anne contracted the disease shortly after. What the final days of both sisters looked like, and who was there to witness them, is documented in testimony that is almost unbearable to read. By February 1945, both Anne and Margot Frank were in the advanced stages of typhus. Leanne Brilsleiper later described visiting them in the barrack during this period. Margot, she said, had become so weak that she could barely speak. In the final days, Margot fell from her bunk. Whether she lost consciousness first or was simply too weak to hold on is not known with certainty. The fall itself, in her already severely weakened state, was beyond what her body could absorb. She died shortly after. Anne was told of Margot's death, or became aware of it. What she understood and what she said in response is not recorded. There was no one with a pen and paper. There was no diary. There was no mechanism in Bergen-Belsen in February 1945 for preserving what the dying said. Leanne Brilsleiper was present near the end. She later described seeing Anne in the days after Margot died, thin to the point of being skeletal, her head shaved against the lice, wrapped in whatever cloth she had managed to keep. Anne told Brilsleiper that she knew Margot was gone and that she herself did not expect to survive. She expressed grief, not panic. She was 15 years old. Anne Frank died at Bergen-Belsen in late February or early March 1945. The exact date was never recorded. In the chaos of the camp's final months, the dead were not individually documented. They were removed from the barracks and placed in mass graves that the SS forced other prisoners to dig. There was no ceremony, no marker, no record of the hour. The camp was liberated by British forces on April 15, 1945, approximately 6 weeks after Anne's death. The soldiers who entered Bergen-Belsen found approximately 60,000 prisoners still alive, in conditions that the commanding officers later described as unlike anything they had encountered in combat. 13,000 unburied bodies lay throughout the camp grounds. Anne Frank had been dead for weeks before anyone came. She died, in the best estimate of historians, in late February 1945. If that estimate is correct, she lived to see the war reach its final phase. By February 1945, the Allied armies were inside Germany's western borders. The Soviet army had already liberated Auschwitz. The Third Reich was weeks from internal collapse. She did not know any of this. In Bergen-Belsen in February 1945, there was no news. There was no way to know how close the end was. Otto Frank was the only member of the 8-person annex group to survive the war. He was liberated at Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, by Soviet forces, and made his way back to Amsterdam through a months-long journey. When he arrived, Mayep Gies gave him the papers she had collected from the annex floor after the arrest. Anne's diary, her notebooks, her loose pages. He read them alone. What happened to the others from the annex, and to the people who had sheltered them, is a set of outcomes as varied as they are sobering. Of the 8 people who had hidden in the annex at Prinsengracht, only Otto Frank returned from the camps. Herman van Pels was gassed at Auschwitz-Birkenau shortly after arrival in the autumn of 1944, though the precise date is uncertain. Augusta van Pels was transferred between several camps, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, and Theresienstadt, and died in the spring of 1945, the exact date and location unknown. Their son, Peter van Pels, who had developed a close friendship with Anne during their time in the annex, was transferred from Auschwitz on the death march westward in January 1945 as Soviet forces approached. These marches, conducted in the depth of winter, without adequate food, clothing, or rest, killed thousands of prisoners before they ever reached a destination. Peter survived the march itself, but died at Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria on May 5, 1945, 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender. He was 18 years old. Fritz Pfeffer, the dentist who had shared the annex, was transferred from Auschwitz to Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg. He died there on December 20, 1944. Margot Frank died at Bergen-Belsen in February 1945, shortly before Anne. Edith Frank died at Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 6, 1945. Of the helpers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler, who had been arrested at the premises on August 4, 1944, were sent to the Amersfoort transit camp in the Netherlands. Kleiman was released after several weeks due to ill health. Kugler was transferred to a forced labor camp in the Netherlands and eventually escaped during a prisoner transport in 1945. Both survived the war. Mayep Gijs and Bep Voskwijl, who had not been arrested on the day of the raid, continued living in Amsterdam through the end of the occupation and survived. Mayep Gijs lived until 2010, dying at the age of 100. She spent much of her later life speaking publicly about her experiences and about the Frank family, and consistently deflected the label of hero that was applied to her, describing what she had done as simply a human obligation. The building at 263 Prinsengracht was preserved. The Anne Frank house, which opened as a museum in 1960, draws over 1 million visitors each year. The hidden annex is still accessible, though stripped of the furniture that Otto Frank had removed before its opening because he found it too painful to see the rooms as they had been. Karl Silberbauer, the SS officer who led the raid on August 4, 1944, was tracked down in Vienna in 1963 by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal. He was still working as a police officer with the Austrian police. He confirmed to investigators that he had conducted the arrest and that the Anne Frank diary was an accurate account of what the annex had looked like. He faced no criminal consequences. He died in 1972. The diary that Mayep Gijs saved from the floor of the annex became something that none of the people connected to it could have anticipated. And understanding what it became requires understanding how close it came to never existing at all. When Otto Frank read his daughter's diary after returning to Amsterdam in June 1945, he was confronted with a version of Anne he had not fully known. She had written with a candor and a literary self-consciousness that went beyond what a father typically sees in a child. She had written honestly about her frustrations with her mother, about her longing for independence, about her aspirations as a writer, about her inner life in all its complexity. She had also, in a diary entry from March 1944, described hearing a radio broadcast in which the Dutch government in exile in London called for people to preserve documents about life under the occupation, personal letters, diaries, anything that captured the experience of ordinary people. Anne heard this broadcast and wrote about it in her diary. She began revising her earlier entries, editing them, shaping them towards something she imagined as a book she might publish after the war. The version of the diary that most of the world knows, published as Het Achterhuis, or The Secret Annex in Dutch in 1947, is a combination of her original diary entries and her own revisions, compiled and edited by Otto with the assistance of a friend. It was rejected by several publishers before being accepted by Contact Publishers in Amsterdam. The initial print run was small. The response, once it appeared, was not. The diary was translated into German in 1950 and into English in 1952, published in the United States and Britain under the title Anne Frank, The Diary of a Young Girl. It became a bestseller. A stage adaptation opened on Broadway in 1955 and won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. A film adaptation followed in 1959. By the time of Otto Frank's death in 1980, the diary had been translated into more than 60 languages and had sold tens of millions of copies. It has since been translated into more than 70 languages. It remains one of the most widely read books in the world. The diary has also, throughout its history, been the subject of denial campaigns. Attempts by those wishing to minimize or dispute the history of the Holocaust to claim it was fabricated or inauthentic. These claims have been thoroughly investigated and comprehensively refuted by forensic examination of the paper, ink, and handwriting conducted by the Netherlands Forensic Institute. The diary is authentic. The handwriting is Anne's. The paper and ink are consistent with the dates of composition. Otto Frank spent the remaining 35 years of his life as the custodian of his daughter's legacy. He answered letters from readers across the world, worked with educators and institutions to ensure the diary was taught in schools, and gave interviews in which he consistently redirected attention from himself toward Anne and toward the broader history her story represented. He remarried in 1953, moved to Basel, Switzerland, and continued his work on behalf of the diary's legacy until his death on August 19, 1980, at the age of 91. He described reading the diary after returning to Amsterdam in 1945 as the experience of discovering that he had not known his daughter as fully as he believed. One of the passages he cited in later interviews was her description of her ambition, her stated desire to go on living even after her death through her writing. It was, he noted, a wish that had been granted in a way she could never have imagined. What the history of Anne Frank ultimately represents, the distance between what was done and what was remembered, is something that the final segment of this story makes inescapable. Anne Frank was 15 years old when she died at Bergen-Belsen. She had spent the preceding 2 years hidden in a set of rooms behind a bookcase, writing by whatever light she could find about a world she was being kept from and hoped one day to rejoin. She did not rejoin it. What she left behind was a document that has outlasted virtually everything else connected to the era that killed her. The regime that arrested her, the officers who processed her transport, the bureaucracy that assigned her a prisoner number. All of that has passed into history. What remains, read by hundreds of millions of people, is her voice. The last entry in Anne's diary was written on August 1st, 1944, 3 days before the raid. She was writing about herself, about the competing sides of her own character, about who she wanted to become. She was 15 years old and thinking about the future. 3 days later, the bookcase was moved aside. The camps, Westerbork, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Bergen-Belsen, took 7 months to kill her. They took Margot and Edith and the Van Pel's family and Fritz Pfeffer. They took the 549 people from her transport who were selected on the ramp at Birkenau on the night of September 5th, 1944, and never registered as prisoners at all. Bergen-Belsen was liberated on April 15th, 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Anne Frank had been dead for roughly 10 weeks by the time it ended. The gap between her death and the liberation, those 10 weeks, is one of the most unbearable facts in a history filled with unbearable facts. She survived 2 years in hiding. She survived Westerbork. She survived the selection ramp at Auschwitz. She survived 8 weeks at Birkenau. And she died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen, within reach of an end she could not see coming. What history owes her is what history owes all of them: to not let the names become abstractions, to hold the specific against the general, to remember that the 6 million were 6 million individuals, each with a name, a face, a set of thoughts they were in the middle of when the world stopped for them. Anne Frank's thoughts are preserved. That is the exception, not the rule. The rule is silence. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.